looks like we're recording, so we're going to be setting up the mood board and style guide for Media Informatics 221. This will also be helpful if you guys are in my 345 class, or I'm sorry, 352 class, the projects class, to better identify what your brand is going to look like. A mood board is rather simple to create. Let me go ahead and pull this up here. You guys all have access to this inside of your files. It's a Brumran Style Guide sample. It's a PDF format, so it should be simple to open. So let's take a look at the mood board. This was created in Photoshop. Pretty simple process. We go out to the Googles and we search for images that appeal to us or appeal to our brand, whatever that might mean, whatever that might be. So we think about our sensibilities, we think about the color, the emotion, the feeling that we get from these images. We try to find things that relate to ourselves, which for our 221 project, we are the brand. So if you were to break yourself down into a group of images, what would those images look like? In this case, we're talking about probably some sort of clothing brand called Salt Damage. So they're going for these pictures of the ocean. Everything's got a real desaturated feel. Everything has kind of a youthful-ish, hip kind of feel. So you've got a guy on a skateboard throwing his head back, but he's wearing some hipster kind of clothes. Interesting style, I suppose. Everything here has kind of an indie feel to it, very desaturated. And you can see that they're also coming in, and they have some notes between some of these, a font and some colors that we're taking up here. So let's talk about that. So inside of a good mood board, not only do we have a set of images that have a feel for what we're shooting for our brand. In this case, you are the brand in 221. For you guys in 352, you have a product that you're trying to find that brand identity for, right? The look and the feel of that brand. So hopefully you've gone out, you already have these images. I don't need to show you guys how to use Photoshop to place these inside of Photoshop or arrange them. Now, the arrangement can be important. In this sense, everything is equally spaced, everything is clean, everything has a nice outline around it, right? These little considerations can play in to the overall feel of the brand, all right? So if I'm looking at this, yes, I have an indie brand, yes, everything is desaturated, but I'm going to start taking all these little design choices I'm making here, just simply for arranging the pictures. I'm going to take those into consideration when we get to the style guide, right? The next thing we want to think about is what fonts are we using? Now, in this particular example, we're pulling up 4 fonts and 4 colors. The minimum you're going to want is 3, primary, a secondary, and a tertiary font, and a primary, secondary, and tertiary color. All right. Generally, I tell people as far as color goes that white, black, and grays are kind of freebies. You can pretty well throw those in and not throw the sensibilities, the visual sensibilities of your brand off. All right. So, as I stated before, over here they chose 4 different fonts. Now, technically they have the same font, but they've just chosen different styles of that same font, which you can do, you can get away with that, but I would encourage you guys to push yourself a little bit further. For a primary, secondary, and tertiary font, you're going to want something that looks really good as a header or in your headlines, something that looks good, probably bold, large. Then you're going to want a really nice body text. Now that's going to be absolutely your most readable font. I would tell you to stick with something that is a sans serif, something that's just really simple to read, has good spacing, nothing ornate. Your title font, the first one we talked about, that one is more of a secondary text, right? Your primary text is going to be your body font. Your secondary text is going to be that for the headers. Now you can get a little bit more artistic in that because it's going to be used large and fairly seldom for the most part. The third, your tertiary, I like to use an italic and I like to use thins. That's just a personal preference. Depending on what brand you're doing, that might not work. But I use my tertiary font as small highlighted areas, typically inside of the body text. So if I have a link, I tend to put the tertiary font into links. If I have something that just needs to jump out, some sort of quote, something along those lines, then I tend to use that tertiary font. All right. Again, you can use a different style of that font, maybe of your body font. So let's say that I'm using Lucida Sans, and then for my tertiary font, I might use Lucida Sans, but I'll use, instead of the regular, maybe I use a thin and italic, a thin italic version of that. And when we get to the style guide, we'll talk about this just a little bit more, how to implement that into your system a little bit better. All right. The next is your colors, right? So we've already talked about how to generate swatches and record our HSB, our CMYK, our RGB values to get those locked in, so that once you've made a really nice color choice, maybe you like this blue here, which is clearly taken from the sky, that you can come back and create and recreate that exact same blue time and time again. All right. So we make all these choices, we lay them out really nicely. We decorate our board, give it some sort of nice background, something that starts to feel like a unified design for your mood board. And then if there's anything that needs to be put into context, if I'm looking at this guy throwing his head back, what's important about this image? Well, the product photography should show people in action, but looking away from the camera. All right, so anybody who's in action should not be looking at the camera. That's just a choice that they're making for their brand. All right, if that's a consistent thing that they're going to look at, well, then you start to develop a look and identity. All right, and then down here we have our three major colors, and then they're pointing out that burnt orange is used as a highlight color. That tells me, as a designer, the primary designer on it's not the person who created the mood board, that I want these top three colors, these two blues and this tan, to make up the vast majority of the design in whatever product this is going to be, whether it's a website or whatever the deal is. And these bits of orange are only going to be used as highlights here and there. All right. So how do we translate this into a style guide? Well, I would have done all of this maybe in Photoshop. I'm going to have you guys use Photoshop. As far as scale, because I know somebody's going to ask me, well, what size should a thing be? It really doesn't matter. For the sake of having enough pixels, enough real estate to get a pretty decent image set up, as well as having ease of usability, I would say just use something like a 1080p, 1920 by 1080p, and that'll give you plenty enough real estate to organize your thoughts. So from there, I'm going to have you guys go over and I'm going to have you introduce yourself to Illustrator. All right. Hopefully all you guys have Adobe Illustrator at home. If not, I would encourage you to go to adobe.com. I believe I sent out an email, and I think the department sent out an email as well on how to get your resources for free. It seems that Adobe is giving, I think it's a 90-day subscription to Adobe products due to this whole Corona nonsense. So go out to your adobe.com. If you don't have your Photoshop and Illustrator, your Adobe products, download it to your home computer or your home laptop yet, go out there, follow the links that they provide based off of the homepage, and you should be able to identify yourself as a student and download, I believe, a free 90-day version of Photoshop, Illustrator. I believe it's pretty much the entire package. So, moving forward. So let me go ahead and explain what we've got here. Now this is a very rudimentary one-page version of a style guide. If you were working for a professional company, your style guide would be a lot healthier than this. This is very slim pickings. All right, but there is enough information here to get started on some branding. So the first thing we see right out of the gate is color, or color swatches. Right, so I set up 4 color swatches, the exact same colors that we use up here. I just color picked them and dropped them into a box, which we'll talk about here in a little bit when I show you how to use Illustrator. And I've gone ahead and shown RGB, HSB, CMYK, and a hex code. That way, any of the most common versions of this color immediately can be pulled from the style guide. So that way everybody's consistent, whether you're a coder or whether you're working in print or whether you're working in digital mediums. All right, so each of those are set up. I'm also adding a little bit of stylization to these boxes just to start to keep a consistency in the way I display my images or imagery, even in the style guide. Right? I come down a little further and I start asking myself, how am I going to demonstrate line? So some of the most basic elements of design. You have color, you have line, you have value, all these different basic compositional theories and basic understandings, shape. So I'm trying to tackle these issues at their root. So first we have our color here. Obviously value is taking place inside of color when we're talking about these swatches. So when we come on to line, I'm going to look at these and I say, well, I'm going to use 3 different variations of line inside of my designs. I'm going to use a 4-point, an 8-point, and 12-point line, and on each of these I'm going to use rounded cap. Now why am I doing that? Well, in this particular design, I like the feel of the round. For me, it feels a little more easygoing, and I'm pulling it from this guy here. And being that this has kind of a laid back feel to it, I feel that the hard corners on this particular brand are a little too harsh. So I want to make something that feels a little more relaxed, a little more laid back. And a rounded corner gives me that. And I'm going to pull that rounded corner into my line work as well, so that my basic line work fits the design feel of just the way I'm handling even boxes. So I'm going to use the rounded cap. Now this is just something you click on inside of Illustrator to give any line an end cap with a different function. And I'll show you that here in a little bit. The next thing we're going to talk about is texture. So the background texture we're going to be using is the dots. Now I created this. I just made a tiny little dot, a 3-pixel dot, and I stuck these out, I believe, like 15 pixels from each other, something along those lines. And then I just duplicated those down and created a really fast pattern. And then that pattern can be used on images and in your background and so forth. The next is the corner. So I said that I wanted rounded corners on all of my images and my boxes and swatches and so forth. Well, what are the calculations for those boxes so that if I'm using a particular rounding on a corner on a particular line thickness, and I hand this project off to another designer in my firm or somebody I'm working with, how do they know how to keep this within inside of the brand restrictions, inside of the style guide? Well, that's my job as a designer to set up those restrictions and to notate all of these, or to denote all of these calculations very clearly, very concisely. All right. So I know I'm using a 4, 8, and 12 line thickness, right? So I come down here and I say, okay, if I'm using a 4-point line with my round cap, if I want this to join rounded, I'm going to use a round joint, which is going to give me this right here. And I'm going to make sure that this corner is an 8-point corner on a 4-point line. All right, and I'll show you how to do all this, so don't freak out. This is all just the theory portion of this. All right, and I go down through here and I try to keep a consistent look and feel, but because the line gets thicker, I have to increase the points in my rounding of the corner, right? So my 8-point becomes 10, my 12-point becomes 12, and so forth and so on. All right. From there, you notice straight below we have some fonts that I chose. For a title font, I chose this Apple Chancery. For a title font, it looked kind of fancy. It's kind of a little bit hip, has kind of a scroll to it, which I thought was nice. And it was just one that seemed interesting at the time, basically. And I think it fits a little bit of the surfy feel. I could go in and really nitpick it and find something better if I choose to. The next for the body text is my Avenir Next, and we talked about how I'm going to kind of cheat, but stay within some limitations. For my accent, I'm using Avenir Next. All right, let me zoom in on these guys a little bit. Okay. So you'll notice again, I'm sticking to my documentation, right? So I know if I'm going to use Apple Chancery as my title font, at 45 points, this is given relative size, right? So at 45 points, I'm going to use 60-point leading and 25 points of tracking, right? So that it has to do with how far apart your letters are, as well as how far apart your returns are for each line. All right. So if my titles are 45 points, my body text and my accent text are going to be 15 points. All right. So this is a relationship that we're setting up between these two texts. So you don't want to get willy-nilly on here. You have to start kind of figuring out these ratios. So if I wanted or needed my body text to be, say, 12 points, I would figure out what that ratio is going to be, and I would lower my title text down to that. And this would also be 12 points because it's the same here. All right. So I come down to my body text. Notice I chose a sans serif. It's easy to read. I chose 15 points, and at 15 points, I'm going to use a 28-point leading, kerning of 0, and a tracking of 25 points. All right, this is spreading things out real nice, making sure that it's easily read. And then for my accent, so I notice I'm also showing you what I'm doing with this title, body, accents, and links. I'm going to use Avenir Next Ultralight Italic. And then at 15 points, same as my body, because both of these are going to occur inside of the body. These are just accents and links inside of the body. In order to make this line up perfectly, because the scale of these letters are different, right? This is an ultra thin, ultra light. At 28 points leading, 0 kerning, I have to change my tracking in order to make it line up perfectly with my body text. Now this is incredibly important because if you're working with a writer, somebody who's crafting all of your body copy for you, it's a copy editor for later on. So if you're working with a copy editor, you're setting up a style guide, you're setting up the look and the feel, but you aren't writing what gets filled into the boxes, the text boxes on the website, right? That's the copy editor's job. Now they're going to come to you and they say, hey, we have all this copy set up. Can you go ahead and drop that in? So you drop it in. All right. Well, you're probably going to drop it in with the body text, okay? And then you're going to design around that chunk of text, however that goes. Maybe your images are going into different places. The tolerances for change may be very small, very slight, all right? So if you set up your entire website to fit the body text, when they come back and they say, hey, we need this line and that line and this line over here to be changed into accents or links, those links, those accents have to fit into the exact same space, same number of pixels in width and height, right, as your body text. That way nothing moves. So that's why you need to figure out what your tracking is, what your leading is, kerning is, in comparison. Generally speaking, if I'm changing tracking, it's probably only going to be a tracking issue here as well, and in this case it is, as long as you're using the same general font. So I'm using Avenir Next, same font, just a different style of that font. All right. So I had to bump this one up to 50-point tracking to get the width of my words here the same as the width of my words here. All right. So again, these are things that we'll look at here in a little bit inside of Illustrator. So some of the next things we're going to look at are how do we handle the logo. Let's skip over this for just a second, the buttons. Inside of the logo, if you've already had a logo, right, which in this case you don't, so this is kind of a placeholder. I'm just using the word logo. And I'm setting up this little graph to show that I need a consistent spacing around my object based off of an arbitrary area of my logo. So what this tells me, this little graph, is that I'm going to use the width of the foot of my L. So this area right here equals n, right? And n is just a number, right? It's just a variable. Those of you guys who remember your algebra days. All right, so this is n, and I'm going to use n as my width and height, so as a buffer all the way around this logo. So no matter how big or small my logo is, n remains relative to itself. Hopefully that makes sense. That buffer will never change. So I'm setting that up, and then if I have a logo at some point down the line, I would take that logo, drop it into here, and rework that spacing to better facilitate that logo. All right. The next thing we're going to look at, I guess we'll come down here and look at these buttons really fast so that we're just learning from left to right. So these buttons are using the different color combinations pulled straight from here. And I'm setting up some very simple rules for very simple buttons inside of my style. So this is going with some sort of flat design, the button standard, button hover, and button clicked or active. Each of these is delineating a purpose, right? So this is how it would look when you first fire it up. When you're hovering over it, obviously for those of you guys who understand CSS, you know what I mean by hover. And then once it's clicked or active, so when I'm on this page, whatever that is, maybe this is the home or it's an about page, then that page has a blue button, okay, with the white text. Okay, so I come through here, I tell you what this button does, and then at 54 pixels of height, that's the button height. Then I'm going to have a 27 pixel curve here and a 36 point text. All right, so I'm giving you relationships inside of this button. So just like the text over here, the relationship between 45 points of your title and 15 points in your body text, you find that calculation. In this case, it's 3 times larger, right? 15, 30, 45. So over here in calculation, and if I need to lower this down to 12, right, you'd have 12, 24, and 36, right, for title. So over here you would figure out that same calculation and apply it. If the button needed to be 40 pixels, then you would find that calculation and apply it to both the curve and the text size in order to make sure it was real nice. Now, you can tell that the curve of this button is perfectly round. That's an easy calculation to figure out. 54 and 27, it's just half, right? So that just means that it's going to pull itself straight up to here without any issue. The big relation here is the 36 points compared to the 54 points of height of the button. That way you end up with a consistent buffer between the top and the bottom. All right? So just make sure you go through and write out anything that you think that is pertinent information next to each of these objects. All right. Some of these should be visually telling, like this. Any designer worth their salt is going to be able to look at this and understand what's going on. The next thing we want to look at is how do we handle images? So the first thing we're going to look at is just a basic old image, right? So if we look up here, this image has been color graded pretty clearly. It's been desaturated, and they put this kind of reddish tan tint over the entire thing, somewhat sepia look. And then they've done a similar thing over here where they've color graded it with this tan color, and it's been desaturated, so it's basically a black and white image with this tan overlaid on top of it. All right. So we're going to do similar things, but a touch more extreme over here. So I've taken an image and I've given it a 10-point corner on the image itself. All right. Now that's done with the mask. We'll look at that here in a little bit. Again, we're still just inside of the theory portion. And I'm writing notes of each little adjustment that I'm making to this image so that when I hand it off to another designer, or I look at this a couple months down the road, a couple weeks down the road, and I ask myself, what the heck is this corner? How did I make that? Visually, it is really simple for me to look at this and go, oh, 8-point corner on the inside for this little accent, and a 10-point corner on the actual object. No problem, piece of cake. Easy to repeat. So a 10-point corner, round. I'm going to use a blending mode of color. So this has the standard image, and I've taken another box over top of it with this orange and used a blending mode of color. So I basically recolorized that image to have this orange over here, right? And I've taken that and lowered it to a 70% opacity, the colorization box. All right. I've given it an inner stroke at 1 point, so that's this dude, with 8-point corners. All right. And I've given it white dot pattern on the bottom. All right. So you could give yourself a large number of these. I would say stick with, just like the rest of our things, a minimum of 3 ways to handle images. So this could be maybe your primary way of handling images inside of your magazine or your website or whatever it is that you're creating, your branded materials. The next thing we're going to look at is more complicated image handling. So in this case, I've created myself a bit more complicated masking system. So I wanted to deal with something that felt like bubbles, wanted to pull more of the circle motif into my images, something that just was a little more interesting. All right. So you'll notice that I've done some color grading again. I've given myself also a really interesting cutout and inconsistencies on the corners, right? Now, obviously, these inconsistencies would be used consistently through maybe like a main subject photograph, right? So perhaps this guy is 90% of the images that you're using, and this one here is the centerpiece, how you're using the title page image or something along those lines, right? Those are things for you to figure out as we go. So in this guy, I have 12-point corner rounds as my consistent or semi-consistent corners, with the top left corner at 50 point, right? So I'm noting those things. I have an image over color box with darken, all right, at 75% opacity. So in this case, I'm saying image over color box, right? And I'm saying that because I'm taking this color over here, the cyan looking color, and I'm putting my image on top of that. And then I'm using a darken blending mode, which you guys should remember from Photoshop. It's going to happen in Illustrator, but I'll show you those things in a bit. With a darken at 75% opacity, darken blending mode. Then I created this little white circle motif for an accent in the bottom. It says bottom left, it's actually the bottom right. So I want to make sure you type that in properly. And then to show you a really good example of what I actually did here, because unless you're paying really close attention, you might not understand how I did this. I created an exact copy of the mask that I created here, right? I tell you 12 point, 12 point, 12 point, 50 point, and I give you an exact replica of the accent piece that I made, right? So this allows the designer to go out there, pick this thing, and then drag it off and start using this in their document. And being that this is a PDF, if I was handing this over to another designer inside of my own company, I would have little templates like this that they could immediately apply inside of an SVG or probably an AI file full of templates that they could just pick and pull from willy-nilly. All right. All right. The next and final thing is to just clean up your file, arrange things really nicely. You notice everything's lined up real nice. My text is directly under, it's centered. Everything's consistent, everything is organized. All right, everything has its place. And then I give it this easy little outline around the entire document. I name my document, I tell you what it's for. If this was for Kroger's or something, I would have the name of the company that this was for down here. Probably a date. Obviously, I likely wouldn't have my name down here because if this was for another company, my name is unimportant. But yeah, so you would have your branding name for you guys, especially in 221. I want your name down here, and I want your Min 221. If you have a name for your company, whatever that might be, you can put that in here as well. All right. And then once you have this entire thing set up, you would export this stuff out as one giant PDF. All right. Now in Illustrator, if you've already done all of this work for your mood board in Photoshop and you save that out as a JPEG, which I would recommend just because it's a little less memory intensive, it's a smaller file. You could also do a PNG. it'll lose a little bit less. Then you can open those two objects, one of whatever your mood board, into um, its own artboard inside of Illustrator. All right. Let's see what kind of time we're looking at right here. So we're already at a 35-minute video with the theory. I'm going to go ahead and upload this, and then I'll be making a new video on how to use Illustrator here in a little bit. All right.